school friends to a small woods out on a nearby farm just outside of town before our parents began the decades of camping that they did. They actually spent, I think, about 5 decades, maybe a little longer, maybe 6. They began with the rental of a pop-up camper, as I recall, which may or may not be accurate. And then eventually they converted into a pull-type, self-contained trailer. And those trailers, as the family grew and as we grew up, the trailer kept getting bigger. Eventually, Mom and Dad's trailer ended up being a seasonal camper. The seasonal camper that they had actually was parked right outside of Edgerton at Hickory Hills Campground, for those of you who know the area. So starting in the mid to late 1960s, when we began camping, our family just kept camping. My parents, upon their retirement, included a camper. They bought a fully self-contained one that you drive from the inside of it, a self-contained unit for their travel and retirement. They most especially and almost specifically used it to go to Gulf Shores during winter, generally from December 1st to the end of March. That camping bug has continued with 2 of my younger siblings owning and traveling with their own campers, so it's moved on in a generation. Now, what in the world, you might be asking by this time, all this camping talk that I've given you, what does that have to do with the Psalms? Particularly this Psalm 69, a psalm of lament. A psalm about disorientation, about God not being like we expect God to be. Lament is the most common category, the most frequent kind of psalm that is there. You might think of them as, if you were thinking of music, as the blues. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Psalms are where people honestly and graphically empty their thoughts and feelings to God, burying themselves in their own trials and anxieties and their gloom and their trauma and their fear and their grief and sometimes even their hatred about how God feels sometimes absent. The psalm writers often boldly tell God, "You're not fulfilling your promises, God. You're not living up to what you have promised before." And they speak truly to God. "Look, God, you're not living up to what you promised. Come on." Sometimes bluntly, those psalmists confront God with sorrows, with complaints, with bitterness, with disappointment, with anger. And we hear a whole bunch of that in today's Psalm 69. These psalms are writings of God to invite us human beings to tell God off. To remind us that God is so great and magnificent and almighty that God can take it. And it's okay for us to complain, sometimes bitterly, when our lives are hard. God provides these laments in the Psalms, in particular, in order that we are able and permitted to say, "Good Lord, God, you're not acting like the God you promised to be. What's up with that? Why aren't you being you?" A camping story, hopefully tying the psalm and the camping together. The first time that I can recall we camped together as a family was in a pop-up camper, and our family traveled from northern Illinois to a state park in Minnesota, not far from the mighty Mississippi River. There was a small creek that ran through the park, small enough that in many places my 3 younger brothers and I could easily leap from one side of it to the other. At the edge of the park on a hillside, we followed the spring back up through the park, and up on this hillside there was a spring that trickled out into a small pool of water. Clear and shallow, the pool was only the depth of our ankles, with the deepest part of that pool, because of course we 4 boys had to get in the pool. The deepest part of the pool by that spring only went up to about our mid-calf, so not very deep at all. What an idyllic place. Trees and birds and water out in nature. It was gorgeous. We fell asleep for the first time in that pop-up camper, able to listen as we were parked not far from the creek, and you could hear the creek as you fell asleep, as I fell asleep, because I like to listen to water. It bubbled and gurgled as it was going down the hill. True white noise to fall asleep to, as we might say these days. As it was just in the pre-dawn hours, as the light was coming out, a heavy thunderstorm pounded the campground. The rangers from the park woke up everyone that was not already awake. I'm sure my mother was awake long before we were, because she didn't like storms. The rangers guided and directed us and all the campers to move to higher ground. And I can remember on that day, I can remember the shock that I had on that particular day. That tiny creek, that little creek that we could almost step across, that tiny creek was now a raging flood. The land on either side of the creek that held that tiny creek way down at the bottom of it now barely contained the flash flood that was continuing downstream. It was that wild, crazy sight, how the racing waters, at least in my mind as I remember it, when we stood in the high ground and we looked at that creek, the waters were knee-high or waist-high above the walls of the creek bed. I'd never seen water flowing like that. I'd never imagined such a flood. We were safe, as were all the campers. There are people and those various trailers. I don't remember if there were any tents there. But I've never seen such an unbelievable, chaotic, destructive power of what water can do when it's enraged and furious, as in a flash flood. Waters that no longer gurgled quietly and softly to calm someone to sleep, but instead it just roared down through the campground, through the park. Not contained, but out of control. Above the walls of the creek bed, 3 feet, the water was running so fast it kept going down the creek bed even though it was above the creek bed. A powerful image. Out of control. Years later, as I grew up, I got to see the floods that happened in small rivers and occasionally the mighty Mississippi River. As we continued to travel, I saw the havoc of the floods from hurricanes, from Hurricane George in Puerto Rico, when we went down after that with Lutheran Disaster Response to help the recovery. The Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, as we went down to that area and multiple times and helped after those hurricanes along the Gulf Coast. And near Fort Myers, Florida, where Montgomery Ward Cottage that we had vacationed at had been obliterated by Hurricane Ian. A cottage that we've not been able to return to. A cottage that was only left with its steps, its concrete steps. Everything else was gone. And the replacement still has not been constructed. Psalm 69 begins with the images of flooding. What it feels like when we are up to our neck in a flood, when we're in mire and